It's the year 1347, and Margot, just 15 years old, finds herself standing at the threshold of her home, a modest stone cottage that feels smaller tonight than ever before. The cool air of the evening seeps through the walls, and the faint glow of candlelight dances across the worn stone. She clutches her wedding shift, a simple woolen garment that has been passed down through generations of women in her family. It is both a symbol of her inheritance and a reminder of what lies ahead. Her new husband, Henrik, nearly twice her age, approaches. He has been chosen for her not out of affection but practicality. He owns pigs and land, securing a future for Margot's family. As he walks towards her, Margot feels a wave of unease. Their union is not the romantic bond that many dream of but a practical arrangement that holds the weight of family and societal expectations. Outside the cottage, the sounds of revelry echo. Voices from Henrik's friends can be heard laughing and cheering, marking the conclusion of the wedding ceremony. Their celebration is not for the bride and groom but for the important ritual that follows, the confirmation of their union. In the medieval world, marriage was not only a personal connection but a public event. The community, the church, and the family all have a role to play in witnessing this intimate moment. As Margot stands in the dimly lit room, she feels the pressure of the moment building. Henrik's approach is not only the start of their marriage but the fulfillment of a long-standing tradition. A tradition that requires the public validation of their union. It's a custom that goes beyond love and companionship. The night is about confirming the marriage through the physical act, and in her world, that act is watched and judged by more than just her husband. In the medieval period, marriage was seen as more than a union of hearts. It was a legal and social contract, one that often involved customs that were foreign to the concept of personal choice or freedom. The pressure on Margot is immense. To perform, to prove, to fulfill the role assigned to her. Her virginity is not just a personal matter, but a public one, tied to family honor and social standing. There is no room for doubt, no space for hesitation. Her first night with Henrik, while intimate, carries with it an unbearable weight. The expectation to meet societal norms and public requirements. In this world, marriage was a performance and Margot was the performer, her body a symbol of familial reputation and societal duty. The validation of her virginity, the confirmation of her role as a wife, would be a matter of public record. It's a tradition that strips away individuality, reducing personal experience to a social transaction. As Margot prepares for this night, she knows the reality that awaits her is far from the romantic ideals she might have once imagined. Instead, it's a duty, a requirement, and a custom that leaves little room for anything else but the fulfillment of roles assigned long before she was born. In the world Margot inhabits, intimacy is never a private affair. The expectations around marriage and sexual relations are shaped by the deeply ingrained influence of the church, the community, and centuries of tradition. The church, in particular, plays a central role in dictating the behavior of married couples. It is not just about love or affection, but about fulfilling obligations tied to both faith and societal status. The weight of these doctrines looms large over every couple, shaping not just their relationship but their entire way of life. The medieval church, with its stringent beliefs, taught that the primary purpose of marriage was procreation, not pleasure. Any form of excess or enjoyment during marriage was viewed as a form of indulgence, even corruption. Saint Jerome, writing in the 4th century, asserted that a man who loved his wife too passionately was committing adultery, because it suggested that desire was a sin. This belief had profound consequences for married couples in medieval Europe, where love and pleasure were seen as secondary to duty and survival. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, went even further, stating that sexual intercourse was only acceptable during certain times and in specific positions. The most acceptable position was man on top, woman beneath, in a face-to-face arrangement. Any deviation from this position, like the woman on top, was seen as unnatural, defying the divine order of male authority. For the church, this was not just a matter of personal preference. It was a question of morality, of sin, and of spiritual purity. The church's teachings also created a long list of sexual taboos for married couples. For example, sexual relations during menstruation, pregnancy, or breastfeeding were forbidden. Oral sex was considered a grave sin, and couples were encouraged to limit their sexual activity to only the times when conception was likely. This meant that, for much of the year, couples could only engage in sexual relations a limited number of days. The church calculated that, under these conditions, a couple could have sex no more than 50 days per year, effectively minimizing pleasure and maximizing procreation. For someone like Margot, these rules would be drilled into her from an early age. Her mother, who had learned them from the local priest, would pass them down, ensuring that Margot would know exactly what was expected of her as a wife. But these teachings were not just theological, they were intensely practical. To follow the church's rules was not simply a matter of spiritual well-being, but of maintaining one's reputation and avoiding the scorn of both family and community. The most daunting part of this system was the belief that even within marriage, pleasure was dangerous. Pleasure was not to be enjoyed for its own sake. It was to be controlled, regulated, and always subordinate to duty. For Margot and countless others like her, the idea of sexual intimacy was a deeply contradictory and confusing one. Pleasure was something that could bring damnation, yet it was an essential part of marriage, a duty that had to be carried out, no matter how uncomfortable or unnatural it might feel. And then there was the matter of her own body. Margot, like all women of her time, would have been taught that her body was inherently flawed. Medieval medical texts, often influenced by ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, portrayed women as defective men. Essentially, their reproductive organs were seen as reversed versions of male genitalia. This belief was not merely ignorance but was codified medical knowledge, taught in universities across Europe. This understanding of the female body carried with it numerous misconceptions. One of the most troubling was the belief that women required prolonged stimulation to conceive. This theory, espoused by medieval physicians such as Constantine the African, led to a bizarre medical doctrine that rape couldn't result in pregnancy because the woman would not receive the necessary pleasure to conceive. When a woman became pregnant after sexual assault, it was often assumed that she must have enjoyed the experience, a tragic and harmful belief that placed the blame on her. In this world of contradictions and false beliefs, Margot's first night of marriage would be a moment fraught with not just physical discomfort, but psychological tension. She would be torn between fulfilling her marital duties, as prescribed by both her husband and the church, and the crushing weight of guilt and fear that had been instilled in her. Pleasure was a sin, desire was dangerous, and every act had the potential to threaten her soul. For medieval women like Margot, sexual relations were not something to be enjoyed. They were acts of survival, dictated by forces much larger than themselves. The marriage bed was where family honor, community reputation, and religious salvation intersected. There was no room for personal enjoyment, no space for intimacy born of affection. In this world, the body was not a site of love but a battleground, where the rules of the church and society governed every action. Margot's wedding night is not just a private affair between husband and wife. It is shaped by centuries of beliefs, superstitions, and medical doctrines that permeate every aspect of life in the medieval world. To understand the deep-rooted tension she faces, we need to explore the strange and sometimes horrifying ideas about the female body that defined medieval sexuality. Medieval Europe's understanding of women's bodies was based on an ancient and deeply flawed belief system. The medical texts of the time, influenced by the writings of ancient Greeks and Romans, taught that women were simply men with inverted organs. The vagina was seen as a kind of inside-out penis, and the ovaries were considered internal testicles. This misguided view of the female body not only shaped how women were viewed sexually, but also how their reproductive function was understood. The church and the medical community shared these misconceptions, and as a result, women's sexuality was constantly under scrutiny. Medieval physicians believed that women's sexual desires were unnatural, even dangerous. They taught that women needed prolonged stimulation and multiple climaxes to conceive, which led to an absurd and harmful belief. Rape couldn't lead to pregnancy because the woman wasn't capable of experiencing the necessary pleasure. If a woman became pregnant after assault, it was assumed that she must have enjoyed it, an appalling idea that shifted the blame onto her and ignored the realities of sexual violence. This perspective had devastating consequences. For Margot, The prospect of fulfilling her marital duties wasn't just about the physical act of sex. It was entangled with the knowledge that her body was viewed as flawed and inherently sinful. This belief in women's sexual deficiency extended beyond the bedroom, creating an atmosphere where women were not seen as full sexual beings but as objects meant for reproduction, often subjected to harsh scrutiny and judgment. Their bodies were never their own. They were always subject to the will of the family, the community, and the church. One of the most pervasive myths that affected women's lives was the belief in the wandering womb. This idea, which had ancient roots in Greek medicine, claimed that the uterus could move around inside a woman's body, traveling up to her chest to suffocate her heart or downwards to escape through her vagina. The wandering womb was blamed for all sorts of ailments, including hysteria, madness, and even death. Treatments for this condition included everything from fumigating the vagina with pleasant smells to drive the womb back into place, to applying foul-smelling substances to bring it down. These bizarre and often painful treatments were the medieval response to something that didn't even exist, yet they were taken seriously by physicians and widely believed. The supernatural also had a hand in shaping medieval sexual beliefs. Women's fertility and sexual health were seen as connected to magical forces. Many women, particularly those in rural areas, sought the help of village-wise women, often labeled as witches by the church. These women had their own knowledge of herbs, rituals, and practices believed to ensure conception or prevent pregnancy. Though often dismissed as superstition by the church, these practices persisted, especially in rural communities where people maintained old pagan beliefs alongside Christian teachings. Pennyroyal and tansy, for instance, were brewed into teas that some believed could prevent pregnancy. These remedies, while widely used, carried a deadly risk. An overdose could easily result in miscarriage or worse. The church officially condemned these practices as witchcraft, yet even devout Christians found it difficult to abandon them entirely. The line between folk medicine and magic was often blurred, especially in a world where superstition was interwoven with daily life. But not all aspects of medieval sexuality were rooted in superstition or religious dogma. Some medieval texts revealed a more sophisticated understanding of sexual relationships, particularly among the nobility. Courtly love, a tradition popularized in the literature of medieval France, elevated romantic and sexual desire to an idealized, spiritual pursuit. While this was more a literary fantasy than a common reality, it reflected a growing tension in medieval society between sexual desire and religious or social constraints. The ideals of courtly love presented a stark contrast to the reality of marriage. In this tradition, love was pure and unattainable, often unfulfilled, and separated from physical desires. The knight's devotion to his lady was meant to be a noble and spiritual longing, never consummated, while the relationship between husband and wife was seen as purely functional, intended solely for procreation. This tension between the sacred and the profane, between romantic love and marital duty, created a complex web of sexual norms that Margot, like every woman of her time, had to navigate. Despite the rigid religious and social expectations, the medieval period also saw some attempts to understand and regulate sexual compatibility. Physical examinations of potential spouses, especially among the nobility, were common. A woman's body was scrutinized for signs of fertility. Wide hips were considered a good omen, while narrow hips might suggest infertility. The groom's sexual compatibility was also assessed, his anatomy examined for its suitability. These assessments were not just about affection. They were about survival, lineage, and family reputation. For Margot, the world she enters on her wedding night is shaped by these beliefs. Her sexuality is not her own. It is something that has been shaped, defined, and scrutinized by centuries of myth, superstition, and societal expectations. As she enters her marriage with Henrik, she is not simply a young bride. She is a pawn in a larger system that sees her body as a tool for reproduction and a symbol of familial honor. The legacy of these beliefs will shape her experiences in ways she cannot yet fully understand. In Margot's world, marriage is not simply a private union between two people. It is a performance. The community plays a crucial role in the validation of her new life, and the expectations placed on her are vast, intricate, and unforgiving. The pressure to uphold family honor, social standing, and religious law weighs heavily on her shoulders. This is not a love match. This is a carefully orchestrated transaction where Margot's worth is not measured by her personality, desires, or happiness, but by her ability to perform her duties as a wife and mother. The wedding night is where it all begins. As soon as Margot and Henrik step into their chamber, the ritual is set in motion. The room may be private, but the act is not. The wedding guests, though they are not physically present, stand vigil outside, awaiting the sound that will confirm the marriage has been consummated. The community's approval depends on this. The bloodied sheets, often displayed as proof, are the public symbol that the marriage is real, that Margot has fulfilled her role. There is no room for discretion or personal choice. This is the medieval world, where everything, including intimacy, is governed by law, tradition, and religious doctrine. For Margot, this public scrutiny is unbearable. The idea of sexual intimacy, which in other contexts might be a personal experience, is viewed by everyone around her as a matter of public record. She is not allowed the privacy of her body. It is a commodity, traded for family prestige and the future of the bloodline. The concept of marital privacy is non-existent, and even the most intimate details of her life are not just discussed but expected to be witnessed by the entire community. Marriage in this world is not about companionship or love. It is about survival, alliances, and the perpetuation of family lineage. As the wedding night progresses, Margot is not just a wife but an instrument of family continuity. Her virginity is not her own. It is the property of her family, and her worth is based on its preservation until the moment it is exchanged. The wedding bed becomes a battleground for family honor, and the act of consummation is nothing more than a formal exchange, governed by societal expectations. This external pressure is compounded by the constant surveillance that Margot faces. The medieval village is a tightly knit, insular community where everyone knows everyone else's business. There is no privacy, no space to escape the judgment of others. As soon as Margot's marriage is consummated, it is no longer just a private event between her and Henrik. It becomes a public spectacle. She is watched, listened to, and scrutinized by the people around her. Neighbors will gossip, priests will preach, and her parents will be involved in confirming that everything has gone according to plan. But the pressure doesn't end with the wedding night. It continues, pervading every aspect of her married life. Margot's ability to bear children will be constantly under evaluation. In a society where infant mortality rates are high and producing heirs is paramount, the failure to conceive is seen as a reflection not just of Margot but of her family. She is expected to bear children, particularly sons, to ensure the family's survival. The shame of infertility, especially in a woman, is deeply ingrained in the medieval mindset. For Margot, the consequences of failure are severe. If she does not conceive, the pressure will only intensify. The community will begin to question her, gossiping about her fertility, her body, her role as a wife. In a world where women are valued primarily for their reproductive function, a failure to perform this duty is not just a personal disappointment, it's a public disgrace. And even if Margot does conceive, the scrutiny does not end there. Her pregnancy, her childbirth, and the health of the child she bears will all be watched with eager eyes. The outcome of each pregnancy will be analyzed, and the survival of her children will be seen as a reflection of her worth and ability to carry the family name forward. In a world of high infant mortality, the survival of a child is a victory, but the pressure to have healthy, strong offspring is unrelenting. As Margot adjusts to her new life as a wife, she begins to understand that her body, once her own, is now a public concern. Every aspect of her life is scrutinized by her family, the village, and the church. Her role is clear: to bear children, to keep the family bloodline intact, and to maintain the honor of her family. Personal desire, pleasure, and emotional connection are luxuries that do not factor into her role. The medieval social structure dictates everything about Margot's life, and this is what marriage is for her: a social contract, a responsibility, and a duty. It is not a relationship between two people. It is a relationship between families, communities, and institutions. Margot's emotional well-being is secondary to the demands placed on her by these forces. As we explore further into Margot's world, it becomes clear that her marriage is not just a personal experience. It is deeply entangled with the political and religious power structures that governed every aspect of life in medieval Europe. The Church holds significant influence over marriage, sexuality, and the moral conduct of its subjects. Its teachings shape the way Margot sees herself, her body, and her role in society. This is a time when the Church's doctrine on sexuality is strict, pervasive, and often cruel. The Church viewed marriage as not just a social contract but a sacrament, something divinely ordained. The wedding ceremony, though steeped in family customs and traditions, was never fully complete without the Church's blessing. The priest would oversee the union, but it was the Church's teachings that framed the very idea of what it meant to be married. Margot's marriage to Henrik, like all marriages, was viewed through the lens of salvation and sin, with every act of intimacy carrying the potential for either divine favor or damnation. Sexuality, in the medieval period, was viewed as something inherently sinful, even within marriage. While procreation was allowed, sexual pleasure was not. The Church's teachings on the matter were clear. If a married couple enjoyed their union too much, they were committing a sin. Saint Jerome, in his writings, had famously stated that excessive love between husband and wife was a form of adultery because it reflected human desires that should not be indulged. For the Church, marriage was not about love, desire, or connection. It was about procreation and the preservation of the human race. This created an oppressive dichotomy for Margot. Her duty as a wife was clear, to provide Henrik with heirs. But how could she navigate the complex and often conflicting messages from the Church, her family, and her own feelings? There was little room for emotional intimacy or sexual connection in the medieval marriage bed, only a sense of duty, of obligation, and a fear of eternal consequences. The Church also dictated the laws surrounding sexual conduct, what was acceptable, what was sinful, and what could cost a person their soul. Sexual acts were prescribed by the clergy, who outlined very specific rules for married couples. As mentioned previously, Thomas Aquinas, the influential medieval theologian, laid out explicit guidelines for marital sex. Sexual intercourse was only permissible during certain days of the week, at particular times of the year, and only in one particular position. Any deviation from this could be viewed as an act of sin, a defiance of God's natural order. This control over sexuality was not just religious, it was political. The Church was a political institution, with the power to influence laws, punishments, and social norms. It could control marriages, influence dynastic unions, and dictate who could marry whom, based on bloodlines, familial connections, and political alliances. In Margot's world, this meant that marriage was not just about personal choice or love. It was about maintaining family honor and aligning with political power structures. Margot was no more than a piece on the chessboard of dynastic politics, a pawn who had to navigate not just personal, familial, and societal expectations, but also the harsh judgments of religious authorities. The power of the Church went beyond marriage. It infiltrated every aspect of medieval sexual life. Confession, for example, was not just a way to repent sins. It was a means for the clergy to maintain control over the personal lives of the people. Every aspect of sexual conduct, from premarital chastity to marital relations, was governed by the confession booth. Men and women alike would confess to their priests, seeking absolution for what they had done wrong. These confessions were not just acts of spiritual cleansing. They were also acts of social compliance, where the people acknowledged the Church's power over their bodies and their lives. But beyond confession, the Church's teachings had a profound effect on how people perceived themselves and their sexual identities. Women, in particular, were taught to view their bodies as both a source of shame and a necessary vessel for procreation. Margot, like all medieval women, would have internalized this belief. Her body was not her own, it belonged to her husband, her family, and, by extension, the Church. She was seen not as an individual with desires or emotions, but as a means of carrying on the family line. In the eyes of the Church, any sexual act that deviated from the prescribed norms could be seen as a violation of God's order. Margot's struggle, then, was not just against societal expectations but against a larger, more powerful system that dictated the very essence of her humanity. Her sexuality was governed by laws and moralities that were not of her own making. Every act of intimacy with Henrik, while intended to fulfill the most basic duty of a wife, was shrouded in fear and anxiety, the fear of sin, of damnation, and of eternal judgment. For Margot, this constant tension between her own desires and the religious doctrine imposed on her was unbearable. She was expected to be a dutiful wife, to fulfill her marital obligations, and to ensure the survival of the family line. But what of her own desires, her own agency? The medieval church didn't allow for that kind of self-expression. Women like Margot were forced into roles defined by others, with little regard for their own wants or needs. The church's role in regulating sexuality created an environment where personal fulfillment was secondary to religious duty. Margot's sexual life, like that of every woman in her time, was about compliance, not pleasure. Her marriage was not a partnership of equals, but a hierarchical structure where her body, her actions, and her very soul were controlled by forces far beyond her control. As Margot's life unfolds, she finds herself increasingly trapped between the expectations placed upon her by society, the church, and her own body. Marriage, in the medieval world, was not a partnership of equals. It was an exchange, a means to ensure the continuity of family bloodlines, social standing, and political influence. Margot's body was never her own. It was a vessel, a means to an end, and every part of her life, including her most intimate moments, was defined by the demands of others. The emotional turmoil Margot experiences is profound. The pressure to conform to the rigid expectations of her marriage, the societal rules about femininity and sexuality, and the moral constraints dictated by the church leaves her with little room to develop her own sense of self. She cannot escape the suffocating weight of these expectations, which surround her every waking moment. From the very first night with Henrik, when her virginity becomes a commodity to be inspected and validated, Margot is left with little agency over her own life. Yet, even in this oppressive environment, Margot's mind remains her own. In the rare moments when she is alone, she retreats into her thoughts, seeking solace in the recesses of her mind. Her emotional life, though constricted by the rigid social and religious frameworks of the time, still seeks to find some form of expression. She may not have control over her body, but her thoughts and feelings, though repressed, are still her own. Margot's frustration grows as she begins to realize that her desires are not just forbidden. They are not even acknowledged. She is expected to submit to Henrik's will, to fulfill the expectations of her family, the church, and society, but her personal desires are never considered. The concept of sexual pleasure is foreign to her. It is not something to be sought or enjoyed, but something to be endured in silence. The medieval worldview does not offer her a space to be an individual. It confines her to a rigid, predefined role that demands nothing but obedience. Over time, the emotional strain begins to show. Margot's anxiety, already heightened by the pressure to perform in the marriage bed, grows as she faces the repeated failures to meet the expectations of her family and society. Her fears about conception, about failing to produce an heir, begin to haunt her thoughts. The pressure of her reproductive role weighs heavily on her. After all, a woman's worth in this world is often measured by her ability to bear children. A failure to conceive is not just a personal disappointment, it's a social disaster, one that would bring shame to her family and disgrace to her husband. As her emotional struggle deepens, Margot begins to feel the toll of the constant judgment and surveillance. Every moment of her life seems to be scrutinized by the people around her, her family, the community, the church. Her private moments, her emotions, and her desires are all up for public inspection. This constant surveillance makes it difficult for Margot to form her own identity. She is always being defined by the roles others expect her to play: the obedient wife, the dutiful daughter, the tool for family continuation. The emotional isolation Margot experiences is profound. Even when surrounded by people, she is always alone, with no outlet for her true feelings. There is no one to share her pain, her frustrations, or her desires with. The marriage bed, the one space where intimacy should be found, is instead a place of torment, a space where her emotional and physical well-being are secondary to the demands of family and tradition. The tragedy of Margot's life is that her individuality is never nurtured. She is never allowed to define herself on her own terms. Her body, her emotions, and her desires are all subordinated to the expectations of others. The medieval system does not leave room for Margot to be an individual. It leaves her as a cog in a machine, a piece in a political game, a woman whose worth is defined not by who she is, but by what she can produce. The emotional cost of this system is immense. Margot begins to withdraw further into herself, her mind the only space left where she has any autonomy. But even this is fleeting. She can never escape the pressure, the judgment, and the fear that dominate her life. The constant surveillance, the expectations, and the demands of marriage continue to define her, even in her innermost thoughts. Margot's life, once filled with possibilities, is now nothing more than a series of performances, each one designed to meet the needs of others and none to fulfill her own. This is the medieval world Margot lives in. A world where women are not allowed to be themselves, where their worth is tied solely to their ability to conform to societal expectations and religious doctrines. The emotional, physical, and psychological toll it takes on Margot is devastating. She is trapped in a system that values her only for her role as a wife, a mother, and a symbol of family honor, not for the person she could have been. As Margot's life continues, she finds herself trapped not just in the expectations of her family, but in a broader, more insidious web of societal pressures. Her role as a wife is clear: to bear children, to continue the family bloodline, and to ensure the survival of her husband's name. This is her primary purpose, and in medieval society, it is the only measure of her worth. As a woman, her body is not her own. It is a vessel, a means to an end, a tool in the perpetuation of family power. In Margot's world, childbearing is not a personal decision. It is a duty, an obligation, and an essential part of her identity. The pressure to produce heirs, especially male heirs, is immense. The survival of the family name depends on it. Failure to conceive, or worse, failure to bear a healthy child, is a disaster that would bring disgrace to her family and tarnish her honor. This pressure is not abstract. It is a daily reality, one that haunts every moment of her life. The Church's teachings add to this burden. Marriage is not just a social contract. It is a sacred institution, and its purpose is to ensure the continuation of humanity. According to medieval doctrine, sexual intercourse between husband and wife is only permissible if it results in procreation. Love and desire have no place here, only the obligation to bear children. This creates a toxic environment for women like Margot, who are expected to fulfill their duty with little regard for their own desires, health, or emotional well-being. Margot is not alone in her suffering. Throughout medieval Europe, women faced the same societal expectations, the same religious doctrines, and the same pressures to bear children. The weight of these expectations can be overwhelming. The medieval understanding of womanhood was simple. Women were meant to be wives and mothers, and their value was measured by their ability to fulfill this role. The Church and society reinforced this belief, and any deviation from this standard was seen as a failure. For Margot, this pressure is magnified by the fear of judgment. As she begins her married life with Henrik, the fear of failing to meet the expectations placed on her consumes her thoughts. She knows that her value is tied to her ability to conceive, and every passing month without a child feels like a personal failure. The idea of infertility, of not being able to fulfill her duty, is a fate worse than death in this world. It is not just a failure of the body. It is a failure of her very purpose as a woman. The community around Margot plays a critical role in reinforcing this pressure. The villagers are not passive observers. They are active participants in the process. They will notice if Margot fails to conceive, and their whispers will reach her ears. Every visit to the priest for confession, every gathering in the village square, is an opportunity for the community to discuss her progress, or lack thereof, in producing an heir. The pressure to conform to these expectations is relentless. Margot is constantly reminded that her body is not her own. It is the property of the family, the community, and the Church. In a society where the survival of the family name depends on procreation, the failure to produce heirs is catastrophic. Margot's worth is tied to her ability to bear children, and the stakes could not be higher. Every failed pregnancy, every miscarriage, deepens her sense of personal failure. Her body is a battleground, an arena where the very meaning of her existence is defined by her ability to fulfill the expectations of others. This struggle is compounded by the fear of death. In medieval Europe, childbirth was a dangerous endeavor. Maternal mortality rates were staggeringly high, and the risk of dying during or shortly after childbirth was a constant threat. Every pregnancy, every labor could be her last. Margot's life is marked not just by the fear of failure but by the very real fear that she might not survive long enough to see the fruits of her labor, or worse, that she might die trying. This fear of death is intertwined with the pressure to produce heirs. The burden is not just about fulfilling familial duty, it is about survival. Margot is caught in a cycle of fear and obligation, where every act of intimacy with Henrik feels like an act of survival. She is not allowed to simply exist in the privacy of her own body. She is constantly reminded that her role is to ensure the survival of the family line. For women like Margot, the medieval marriage bed is not a place of love or connection. It is a place of duty, a place where women's worth is measured not by their desires, but by their ability to conceive. The pressure is suffocating, and the emotional toll it takes is profound. Margot's life is defined by this constant struggle, a struggle to meet the demands placed on her body, her mind, and her spirit. And as the years go on, it becomes clear that the medieval world offers no room for personal fulfillment, for connection, or for love. The idea of sexual pleasure, even within marriage, is foreign to Margot. The medieval view of sexuality is rooted in guilt and fear, where every moment of intimacy carries the weight of sin, of divine judgment, and of societal expectations. Love is not the driving force behind Margot's marriage. It is duty, survival, and the pressure to maintain the family name. As Margot's life stretches on, the external pressures and the constant expectations placed upon her only grow stronger. The weight of societal norms, religious doctrine, and familial duty, which have shaped every aspect of her existence, begin to crush her sense of self. In a world where women are not valued for their individuality, but for their reproductive function, Margot's identity becomes increasingly defined by her failures and successes in meeting these external expectations. The pressure to conceive continues to haunt Margot. Every passing month without a child, every failed pregnancy, only reinforces the idea that her body is not hers to control. Her worth, her entire existence, is wrapped up in the role she is expected to fulfill. The very concept of her being, of who she is as a woman, is subsumed by her ability to bear children. She begins to lose sight of herself as an individual. Her desires, her dreams, her emotional needs are all secondary to the larger task at hand: survival, family continuity, and the perpetuation of the bloodline. In her quiet moments, Margot may reflect on what it means to be a woman in this world. But these moments of introspection are fleeting. The harsh reality of her life is that she is not permitted the luxury of individuality. Her life is mapped out for her. The marriage, the children, the expectations, and it leaves no room for her to explore who she is beyond her duties. She is a wife, a mother, but nothing more. She is not allowed the space to dream, to desire, to live for herself. And as the years go by, the weight of these expectations presses down harder and harder, leaving her with nothing but a sense of emptiness and loss. Her marriage to Henrik, which began as an obligation, continues to unfold in the same pattern. Henrik, like so many men of the time, sees Margot as a means to an end. She is a vessel for the family bloodline, a tool to produce heirs. His desires, needs, and expectations dominate their relationship, while Margot's emotional well-being is relegated to the background. Even though Margot may experience moments of intimacy and connection with Henrik, these moments are always tainted by the larger framework in which they exist. Their relationship is not one of love or mutual understanding. It is one of duty, obligation, and survival. As Margot faces the possibility of never bearing a child, she begins to feel the sting of rejection not just from Henrik, but from the larger world around her. In a society where women are valued primarily for their ability to reproduce, Margot begins to see herself as a failure. Her sense of self-worth is intrinsically tied to her fertility, and every month that passes without a pregnancy deepens her shame. The fear of public judgment, of being seen as inadequate or broken, weighs heavily on her. It is a fear that isolates her from the very community she depends on for support and survival. Margot's emotional isolation grows. Even though she is surrounded by people, Henrik, her family, the villagers, she begins to feel more alone than ever. The space where she once might have had a chance to express her own desires, hopes, and fears is now occupied by the constant demands of others. Her life becomes a series of performances, where every action, every word, every gesture is calculated to meet the expectations of those around her. There is no room for Margot to simply exist as herself. As the years go by, Margot begins to lose the ability to differentiate between what is expected of her and what she actually wants. The pressure to conform, to fulfill her role as a wife and mother, has consumed her identity. The dreams she might have had, dreams of love, of connection, of self-fulfillment, are now distant memories, buried beneath the crushing weight of her obligations. In the silence of her own thoughts, Margot may wonder who she truly is. Who is she beyond the role of wife, beyond the role of mother? But these questions are left unanswered, for there is no space in her world for such introspection. She is trapped in a cycle where her value is measured not by her humanity, but by her ability to fulfill a role she never chose. Her individuality, her essence, is lost in the endless pressure to perform, to conform, and to survive. As Margot's life continues, the emotional and psychological toll becomes evident. She is not just physically exhausted by the demands of her role, but emotionally drained by the constant pressure to live up to the expectations placed upon her. Her body, her mind, and her spirit are all consumed by the weight of this burden. And as the years go by, it becomes increasingly clear that there is no escape. There is no room for Margot to simply be herself. She is a reflection of the societal forces that have shaped her, a woman whose life has been defined by the demands of others, not by her own desires or needs. As Margot's life progresses, the weight of her duty, her societal role, and the crushing emotional burden of unfulfilled expectations begin to manifest in her very being. The years of trying to conceive, the pressure to produce heirs, and the continuous cycle of disappointment take their toll. The physical toll is evident. Her body, worn down by repeated pregnancies and miscarriages, becomes frail and weak. But perhaps the more insidious cost is the psychological one. Margot is slowly losing herself, her sense of autonomy, and her very spirit, as she surrenders to the relentless demands of those around her. The reality of medieval life for women like Margot is a constant struggle for survival. Not just physical survival, but emotional and mental survival as well. The world she lives in does not offer her the luxury of self-determination or emotional expression. Her every action, every choice, is bound by the rigid expectations of the family, the church, and society. And as time goes on, the pressure becomes unbearable. The hope of escaping this suffocating world seems increasingly remote. Margot, once a young bride with the possibility of dreams and desires, now finds herself trapped in a cycle she cannot escape. Every aspect of her life, her marriage, her role as a wife, her ability to bear children, is governed by forces beyond her control. The very act of becoming a mother, which should have been an expression of love and connection, becomes a battleground where Margot's worth is tested, weighed, and judged. The failure to conceive, the constant miscarriages, the loss of each child she brings into the world, it all compounds the emotional strain. With each failure, Margot feels more inadequate, more broken, and the absence of support, emotional validation, and care from her husband, Henrik, only deepens the sense of isolation. He, like the rest of society, sees her as a means to an end, not as a partner, not as an individual with her own desires and needs. She is expected to fulfill her duty, and every failure is perceived as a personal shortcoming. The weight of this perception shapes Margot's identity. Over time, she begins to internalize this view of herself. She no longer sees herself as a woman with potential beyond motherhood. She sees herself only in terms of her reproductive ability. The pressure to produce a son, to ensure the survival of the family name, is so overwhelming that it consumes her entire sense of self. Her worth is reduced to her ability to conceive, and every failure to do so is a reflection of her worthlessness. What makes this situation all the more tragic is the fact that Margot never had the opportunity to choose her path. Her marriage was arranged by her father, a transaction that defined the trajectory of her life from the very beginning. The emotional, physical, and psychological toll she endures is not just a result of personal misfortune. It is a direct consequence of a system that sees women as property, as tools to further political and familial interests. By the time Margot reaches her middle years, she has given up the idea of escape. The dream of love, of connection, of personal fulfillment has long since faded. The pressures of survival, the constant demands of family, community, and church have worn her down to the point where she no longer knows who she is outside of these roles. She no longer expects relief from her emotional turmoil, and the idea of reclaiming her own identity seems like a distant, impossible dream. Margot's life has become a series of reactions to the expectations placed upon her. Her choices, her emotions, and even her desires are determined by others, not by herself. The fact that she must constantly prove her worth, through conception and childbearing, leaves her with no space to live for herself. Her individuality is lost in the process, and with it, her sense of joy, hope, and fulfillment. As Margot enters her later years, the physical toll of repeated pregnancies and the emotional toll of constant failure take their final toll on her. Her body, once vibrant and capable of carrying the promise of future generations, has become frail and worn. Her spirit, once full of the potential for independence and self-expression, has been stifled under the crushing weight of expectation. At this point, Margot has become a symbol of the medieval woman's struggle, trapped in a cycle of duty, obligation, and survival, with little chance for personal fulfillment. Her life, though long and full of hard work and dedication, is ultimately one defined by sacrifice. Sacrifice for the family, sacrifice for the bloodline, and sacrifice for the community. She has given everything of herself, only to find that the price of survival in this medieval world has been her very identity. Her story is a tragic reminder of the human cost of a world that values conformity, duty, and tradition over individuality, freedom, and emotional well-being. Margot's surrender is not just a personal tragedy. It is a reflection of the larger social, religious, and cultural systems that have shaped and constrained her existence. As Margot reaches the twilight of her life, the legacy of the world she was born into becomes more apparent than ever. The weight of her years, her constant struggle to meet the demands placed on her, and the physical toll of childbearing leave her a shadow of the woman she once might have been. Now, at the end of her journey, Margot reflects on the life she has lived. A life spent fulfilling others' expectations, a life defined by sacrifice and duty, a life in which her own identity was never truly her own. The pressures she faced never truly eased. From her marriage to Henrik, to the endless cycle of childbirth and miscarriage, Margot was never allowed to live for herself. Her every action was dictated by the needs of the family, the expectations of society, and the relentless drive to preserve the bloodline. Every moment of intimacy, every moment of potential joy, was overshadowed by the knowledge that her body existed for a singular purpose: to produce heirs to continue the family name. But as Margot ages, she begins to see the futility of the system that has shaped her life. The bloodline, which has consumed so much of her energy and her existence, is in danger of withering. She is left with nothing but the knowledge that her life, though lived with devotion, has ultimately been a story of survival. A story where her identity was lost in the face of duty. Margot may have fulfilled her role as a wife, as a mother, as a daughter, but at what cost? The emotional toll, the physical strain, and the emotional isolation that she has endured over the years have left her with little more than exhaustion and regret. Margot's final years are marked by a profound sense of loss. Not just the loss of her own personal hopes and dreams, but the loss of the life she might have had if she had been allowed to live on her own terms. As her children grow, they become the new bearers of the family legacy, but they are also caught in the same web of expectations that Margot was trapped in. The cycle continues, generation after generation, where women's lives are defined not by their own desires, but by the demands of society, the church, and the family. In her final moments, Margot finds herself questioning the value of everything she has done. Was it worth it? Was it worth sacrificing her own identity for the sake of family honor, for the preservation of the bloodline? The question hangs heavy in her mind, unanswered. She has lived her life fulfilling the expectations of others, but now, at the end of it, she wonders what it all amounts to. Her legacy, though full of sacrifice, is also a silent protest, a quiet cry for autonomy, for individuality, for the right to exist beyond the roles imposed upon her. Though she may never have had the chance to live for herself, her story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the unacknowledged strength of women who lived and died in a world that saw them only as vessels for others' desires. The world Margot lived in, with its rigid structures and oppressive expectations, may have stripped her of her individuality, but it did not extinguish her humanity. In the end, it is not the fulfillment of her societal duties that defines her. It is the quiet rebellion in her heart, the quiet desire to be more than just a tool of reproduction, that defines her legacy. In the shadows of history, the stories of women like Margot are often lost, overshadowed by the more grandiose tales of kings, warriors, and dynasties. But their stories are just as important, just as powerful, for they remind us of the cost of power and legacy, the cost of ignoring the humanity of those who are meant to bear it. Margot's life may have been one of sacrifice, but it is also one of quiet resilience, of surviving in a world that sought to erase her sense of self. And in the end, that is her true legacy, the ability to survive, to endure, to exist in a world that tried to strip her of her identity.